Hello everybody and welcome to lesson number 5 of Middle School Math 1. Today we're going to be focusing on working with decimals again, but specifically we're going to be multiplying them. So let's take a look at our focus for the day. We're going to be multiplying decimals and to do mental math using the properties of multiplication. By the end of this lesson you should be able to answer these two essential questions. The first of which is, what are the properties of multiplication? The second are, how do you multiply decimals? You should be able to explain to somebody else, to me as your teacher, a little brother or sister, another classmate, how exactly you multiply decimals. What are the steps that need to be taken in order to do that? Before we move on to multiplying decimals, let's review how to add decimals. Let's take a look at this review. The first step we have to do to add decimals is we need to line up those decimal points. Then insert zeros where we need to in order to take the spot of a certain place value. We add or subtract in this case we are adding, and then we drag down that decimal point. So that's just a review on how to add decimals. We're also going to be talking about the properties of multiplication, but before we do that, let's review what the properties of addition are. So let's take a look. The identity property of addition states that the sum of 0 and any number is that number. So whatever number plus 0 is going to equal that value. An example here, we have 5.6 plus 0 is going to equal 5.6. Next we have the commutative property, which states that changing the order, no matter what order the numbers are in, it's not going to matter. It's still going to equal the same amount. And then we have the associative property, which states that changing the grouping of the numbers that are being added doesn't change the sum either. And the sum is the answer to our addition problem. These terms are going to be the same as when we talk about the properties of multiplication. They're just a little bit different and we add one. So without any further ado, let's get into talking about multiplying decimals. I figured we'd start this lesson with a word problem, a very realistic example of multiplying decimals. Our word problem is, at your first job you earn $7.30 per hour. You work for 2.5 hours. How much money do you earn? So you're figuring out how much money you earned in those 2.5 hours. Our first step to multiplying decimals is to multiply them as if they were whole numbers. So we're taking away those decimals. This is what it looks like. 7.30, when we take away the decimals, is 730. And 2.5 hours. 2.5 written as a decimal is 2.5. So we're going to take that away because we are multiplying as if they are whole numbers. From there, we multiply to equal 18,250. But our second step is to figure out how many decimal places do we need to fill in. So in this case, we have 1, 2, 3. So with our answer, we need to move our decimal point 1, 2, 3 places. And we can figure out that we can drop that 0 and that we would earn $18.25 in those 2.5 hours. So let's do an example together. The values that we are multiplying in this example are 11.4. We're going to multiply that by 3.6. So our first step is to multiply these as whole numbers. But let's keep in mind that we have 2 decimal places. 2 place values after the decimal. That information will come in very handy later. 2 decimal places. That'll come into play once we do the second step. So let's multiply these as if they're whole numbers. We have 114 multiplied by 36. Let's multiply down. 4 times 6 equals 24. It's carrier 2. 1 times 6 equals 6 plus 2 is 8. And 1 times 6 is 6. Now I always like to mark my place so I don't accidentally put a value here that I shouldn't. Now we're going to multiply 4 times 3, which is 12. Carry our 1. 1 times 3 is 3 plus 1 is 4. And then 1 times 3 is 3. Now we add up these values. 4, this would be a 0. 4 plus 0 is 4. 8 plus 2 is 10. Carry our 1. 6 plus 4 is 10, plus another 1 is 11. Carry our 1. 1 plus 3 is 4. Now we're left with 4,104. But we still have that second step where we need to put our decimal back in. And we already said that it takes up 2 decimal places. So we have 1, 2 bunny hops. So our decimal point would go in between the 1 and the 0. And there you have multiplying 2 decimal values. If you have any questions on how to multiply decimals, please don't hesitate to let me know. But for right now, we're going to move on to talking about the properties of multiplication. The first of which is the identity property of multiplication, which states that any number times 1 is itself. So here we have an example. 5 times 1 equals 5. Or any number for that matter, no matter how big or small it is. 25 times 1 equals 25. 363 times 1 equals 363, and so on and so forth. So the identity property of multiplication states that any number multiplied by 1 is itself. The second property of multiplication is the zero property. This one's pretty self-explanatory, which states that any number multiplied by 0 is 0. Doesn't matter what it is. Anything multiplied by 0 is always going to equal 0. This property, the commutative property of multiplication, is defined the same way as it is for the commutative property of addition. Doesn't matter whether we change the order of the factors, it's still not going to change the product. It's still not going to change the answer to the multiplication problem. And with the associative property, that changes with the grouping. Doesn't matter if the grouping is one way or another, it still doesn't change the answer to your multiplication problem. So let's take a look at this multiplication problem to figure out if we can use different properties of multiplication to help make this easier for us to solve in our heads. First, I'm going to use the commutative property, which states that no matter what the order of this problem is, it's still going to have the same product. But I'm going to change the order to be 4 times 0.25 times 3.58. And you will see why. So this is the commutative property. I'm changing the order of what they are in. So let's take a look at what 4 times 0.25 are. But I'm going to multiply them as whole numbers. And I'm going to keep in mind that there are 2 place values that I'm going to need to move my decimal point over to. So we have 25 times 4. 5 times 4 equals 20. Carry my 2. 2 times 4 equals 8, plus 2 is 10. Now this is where I need to move my decimal point over 2 place values. 1, 2. So I'm left with 1 and their decimal point, the whole number of 1. I'm going to drop down the rest of my problem. 1 is now being multiplied by 3.58, which is also the identity property of multiplication. Anything multiplied by 1 is itself. So in this case, our product would be 3.58 because it's being multiplied by 1. So the answer would be itself. Now we're to the point in our lesson where we're going to review what we have covered so far and to see if we can answer these questions. What are the properties of multiplication? And how do you multiply decimals? If you aren't able to answer these questions on your own, please contact me and let me know what other questions you might have. Maybe it is really getting down how to multiply those decimals, the steps that need to be taken in order to multiply them successfully, or being able to use the properties of multiplication effectively in order to better use mental math when solving using multiplication with decimals. This is the end of our lesson, so make sure that you complete the questions below. And like I said, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please make sure to address them my way. Bye, guys.